Now I would like to introduce Dr. Pascale Champagne, a professor in the departments of Civil and Chemical Engineering here at Queen's and the Canada Research Chair in Bioresource Engineering. Dr. Champagne is an internationally recognized researcher whose diverse and innovative research program in the fields of environmental engineering and bioresource management aims to use green chemistry and renewable resources to establish a future supply of sustainable bioenergy and fuel material. Specifically, her research focuses on the development of alternate water and waste management strategies and environmentally sustainable solutions for managing bioresources. Now, as policy students, some of this may be a little bit over our heads, but Dr. Champagne's research addresses a number of Canadian policies that incentivize generating renewable energy and managing water, waste, and renewable resources in an environmentally sustainable fashion. Dr. Champagne is known for using her research to solve real-world problems, creating strategies that will work when put into practice. For example, one of her projects is aiming to simultaneously address two problems occurring within Kingston right now. One is how to reduce a large output of carbon dioxide that's being emitted from the industrial company Lafarge, and two is how to deal with the huge amounts of wastewater from Utilities Kingston. She's using algae to solve both these problems. Using the excess carbon dioxide from Lafarge to spur the growth of algae in Utilities Kingston treatment ponds to purify the water, then harvesting that algae and refining it into a biofuel to power both companies. She's working collaboratively with a team from a variety of backgrounds to do this: chemists, biologists, policy experts, and analysts. Moreover, many of her projects are in collaboration with private industries, government agencies, and municipalities. Today, Dr. Champagne is here to discuss water policy in Canada. Her talk is sure to get us thinking and asking questions. Please use Slido to ask those questions using the hashtag MPA19. You can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. You can post questions throughout the talk, and they will show on the screen once Dr. Champagne has finished her presentation. As in the past, we will pose the questions with the most votes. We will also take a few questions from the crowd. Now please join me now in welcoming Dr. Pascale Champagne.
Thank you for that very lengthy introduction, but very good, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. When I was asked to do this, I said, I'm not a policy expert. I understand that water is really complex from a chemical point of view, biological point of view, and a management point of view. But it's not until I started doing a little bit of research for this talk that I realized that the complexity of the policy issues in Canada related to water are almost as bad as the ones that I have to deal with on a scientific level. So if this is an issue that you want to tackle, I would say you have your work cut out for you as well. All right, so bear with me. So today I'm going to focus on just really the 101s of how we manage water policy in Canada. And I'm not seeing it on my screen here, so you'll have to bear with me. Okay, so in terms of water governance, what does it mean and why does it matter? So if we have clean water and accessible water, we have healthy people, we have increased prosperity, we have an equitable society, and protected ecosystems, and as well as a resilient community, which is ultimately what we aim for. And all this can be achieved through universal access to safe drinking water, sanitation and hygiene, sustainable use of that water resource, robust and effective water governance, and that's really what the focus will be here, improve water quality and wastewater management, and that also falls under that policy structure, and a reduced risk to water-related disasters. And as we start talking about climate change and changing weather patterns, this may be one of the issues that will be quite relevant in your work span. So if we look at water facts, so how much water is there when we talk about the water that we want to govern in terms of water quality, water quantity, and how it's used and extracted? Some of you may have seen this. In terms of total global water, there's about 2.5% that's fresh water, and really that's the stuff we want to drink, right? Of that 2.5, about 69%, 68.7% is tied up in glaciers and ice caps, and we don't really want them all to melt in order for us to use them because that engenders other issues. Groundwater is about 30%, so it's accessible, but of that groundwater, only 50% is accessible in terms of our current technologies for drilling and extraction, in terms of economic viability. And then we have 1.2% that is surface and other fresh water. Okay, so that puts things into context. Of that 1.2%, that's surface and other fresh water, so readily accessible, only about 20.9%, or about 21% of that is in lakes. The rest is in living things, including humans, moisture, atmosphere, and then we're looking at ground and ice and permafrost. That's about close to 70%. So really, when we talk about water policy, even within Canada where we have lots of water, we're talking about managing this 1.2% and making sure that it's accessible, that it's clean, and that it's accessible, clean, and available to those who need it. So in terms of water governance, so governing that water, managing that water, having policies around that water is very important. So it's got a wide range of social, environmental, and economic implications, okay, depending on businesses that need water, people need water, and obviously we have a whole environment that revolves around that accessibility to water. So permeates all facets of society. It's directly connected with policy because of those things. So think about how water impacts your daily life from the minute you get up in the morning to the minute you go to bed at night. Right? We'll talk a little bit about that. So some of you may be familiar with policy because this is your area of expertise, but I noticed that there's some of my students in the room that came to support their engineers, so I'm going to give you a little crash course on what governance is. And it's also a shameless plug for our new diploma program on the Beaty Water Research Centre, that building that's at the corner of Union Division that's going to open up. So the third floor is going to be the Beaty Water Research Centre, of which I'm director. And we're going to have, hopefully, if everything goes well, a water and human health diploma that's going to be offered. So this is one of the slide decks that the instructor that's developing the course, Jeff Hall, has put together.
What is governance? Governance at its highest level is a framework where stakeholders from many levels of society can come together to effect positive change. It includes social, economic, and political influences. Water governance is the application of these ideals to the management of water resources. Why do we need water governance? Well, good governance at its many levels provides for a number of positive benefits for society. Here's a good example. If you live in a community where you woke up in the morning, turned on the water in your house, and didn't think about whether the water was safe, several layers of water governance were likely in place in order to create the conditions to ensure you routinely have access to safe water. There are many definitions of governance, so we use the United Nations. The United Nations defines governance as the process of decision-making and the process by which decisions are implemented or not implemented. We can go beyond this to say that good governance can be defined as having critical components that come together to make effective and efficient governance happen. These components are that it is participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and finally, that it follows the rule of law. These fundamental pieces of good governance can also be applied to water. And when they are applied to water, we see many outcomes. This includes increased health for people, increased prosperity, both individually and at the community level. We see an increase in the equity within society. We also see the environment and ecosystems being protected. And finally, we see an overall increase in the resilience of communities. So the next time you pour a glass of water, you can think about whether or not there's good governance or an absence or failure of good governance at play with that water.
All right, so moving along, so keeping those questions in mind, do we have good water governance in Canada? Okay, and no, I don't want you to answer the question, and I will not answer the question for you. I would like you to reflect on that, because hopefully if you think the answer is no or it could be improved, then this will be your role. So what is good water governance? So institutions used to implement and manage specific governance regimes, and you'd be very surprised to hear, and we'll talk about those different things. There's actually, depending on the province, there's 4 different ways that we manage water in Canada. Okay, there's 4 approaches, and I'll touch more on those. Functional institutions would be multi-sectored and multi-leveled, and they would be integrated, so they would be communicating with each other. Then that would decrease the overlap and redundant operation. They would involve a participation by a wide group of stakeholders and also allow for accountability and transparency. So if I look at water institution, there's really 3 different pieces to that. There's the water law, which really deals with things like what are the rights in terms of legal perspective, deals with conflict resolution, tends to want to centralize things. If we look at water policy, in this case, we look at priority. Who should be using water? Which projects are more significant or more important? Tends to also address things or issues related to pricing and cost recovery. Any type of water transfers, because this could be a practice that's in place depending on the jurisdiction or legislation that governs water use. It tends to favor decentralization. And then finally, there's water administration. So this is the one like Utilities Kingston, for example. So it involves several layers of government. It can be provincial, federal, and municipal. And then most of the time in Canada, it involves all 3 layers. It deals with things like collecting fees. So those of you who own a home, you know that you pay a bill at the end of the month unless you're on a well or something of that nature. It also deals with regulations and accountability, and also has to deal with the technical capacity. How do we fund these projects? So what regulations are pertinent? And we're going to focus on Canada because I would argue that water policies are different wherever you go in the world, and trying to find some common ground other than the UN as an overarching water quality and the right to access safe drinking water. There's not a lot of commonality. There's commonality, but they're not integrated at all. So what are the practices in Canada that would need some level of regulation? So if we look at it, we've got infrastructure. So do you build a sewer here or do you build it over there? Water distribution line. Do you put a bridge where that might impact your waterway? So all those infrastructure projects need to consider what's happening to water and access to water and water quality. Forest management. That one's a little bit obvious. We need to have water to grow trees. It also, any type of development, so can you build a city here? Can you expand the city? Okay, and with growing populations, one of the things that's limiting the growth of municipalities is really whether the people will have access to safe drinking water. If you look at out west, one of the reasons that things haven't built up in permanent infrastructure as much as it could have is because of that access to drinking water. Agriculture and industrial activity, and finally recreation. And that shouldn't be necessarily at the bottom of the list, but it's an important one. So watershed regulations. So watershed, for those of you who don't know, is it's any body that will receive water and then channel water in a particular direction. Okay, so it's a very broad definition, but we can have a geography course after this. Canada does not have a national water strategy. Does that surprise you? No? Okay, good. So we have a Canadian Constitution, though. We've got some federal rules and guidelines and acts and legislation. So that tends to deal with international waters, especially when we're talking about fighting over fish, right? Fisheries, navigation, and federal land. On a provincial level, we tend to deal with water resources and supply and natural resources. And municipal level is where we tend to deal with water supply and and by that I also mean water treatment and water quality. So with these, this fragmentation of responsibility, and what we would need to make sure is that there's lots of integration. Would you say that it's well integrated? No? I'm getting a hard no, and this is my go-to person right here. Probably not. I would agree that we don't have as much integration. I don't want to be too critical because it is difficult. It's a very complex issue. It's water. But we could do better in terms of integrating those different layers. Water regulations and policy in many cases are carry over from a time of this is the way we've always done things, or this is the way these people were here first, and we'll get to some examples of that. And that's how things are dealt with. So let's look at a few water facts. So things that we're hearing in the news. The atmosphere is changing. Okay, whether you believe in climate change and that we're responsible for climate change or not, the atmosphere is changing. Water distribution, how it falls, where it falls, is changing. Back in 2002, 1 in 4 cities in Canada had experienced a water shortage within that last decade. That number has not changed. Okay. Drinking water advisories for Canada, there are 1,700 in place at any given time. Those numbers have not changed. Okay? Location may have changed, but that number in terms of its magnitude has not changed. 100 First Nations communities under permanent boil water advisories. If that number has changed, it has tended to increase. In Canada, groundwater is used by at least 10 million people in terms of access. And this is significant, keep that in mind, because groundwater has a different way of being managed or policed, if you want, in terms of policy, than surface water does. Okay? Climate change has changed the traditional water budget models. So we know this as people in academia, but we're not sure that everything has percolated down to policy. Okay, so because we've demonstrated this scientifically through modeling, that doesn't mean that policies have caught up in terms of how we manage and those resources. Okay, so let's talk about some of those different jurisdictions. So federal jurisdiction, what's a general federal responsibilities? Navigation, okay, Transport Canada, and hopefully this picture kind of captures a little bit of everything. So we've got navigation on waterways. Having enough water to permit transportation and the transfer of goods is really important, especially in the Great Lakes area. Fisheries, Department of Fisheries and Ocean is who handles that. National parks, we also have provincial parks, but we have national parks. And a lot of the forest management is through national parks. We have First Nation reserves. In terms of acts that or legislation that tends to deal with federal jurisdiction, we have the Arctic Water Pollution Prevention Act, and basically tends to deal with pollution in the Arctic area or prevention of it. We have the Shipping Act. So one example that it deals with is ballast water discharge. We have Fisheries Act from an environmental perspective. We don't want to harm fish. We need it in terms of industry and in terms of food source. And we also have the Species at Risk Act that tends to look at habitat protection. On a provincial level, we have, in terms of responsibility, we tend to look at how water flows. So how much water flows, where does it flow, How does it go? Okay. Water use and water taking. And we'll talk more about water use and water taking and those allocations. So you'll notice that a lot of this right here falls under provincial jurisdiction, okay? Except what happens on First Nation communities. Also tends to deal with any hydroelectric power generation, which in Canada is pretty important. And water pollution and water quality regulations all fall under the provincial jurisdictions. There's been a little bit of movement and integration with Environment Canada in terms of water quality, but this is 2012, so fairly recent when we think about it. So in terms of Ontario, so let's focus on Ontario. We have the Clean Water Act, which protects some of the source of drinking water. Okay, so that makes sure that the water from which your water, Lake Ontario, is protected so that you will have access to safe drinking water. Identifies any threats to source water, okay, and requires some level of planning. We also have the Safe Drinking Water Act. And what it does is it tends to manage water utilities or regulate water utilities, drinking water systems, and any type of water quality issues. It also sets the standards for operators and standards for testing. And a lot of that became more relevant after the issue in the incident in Walkerton. We also have other legislative pieces. We have the Ontario Water Resources Act, the Water Opportunities Act, and then we have different funding mechanisms. We have the Environmental Bill of Rights and the Environmental Protection Act. So this is just to tell you that to show you that we have several layers of legislation that don't always work together. And actually, some of them sometimes are contradictory to each other, okay? And so that level of integration is very difficult. Okay, and this is an example of a few more. All right, so municipal jurisdiction. In this case, we're looking at water utilities and provision of residential treated water is one example. And also make sure that if you're going to take water from somewhere, you're going to treat it, give it to the users. They're going to put it in the toilet or wherever, get down the drain. And so that needs to be treated and sent back to the receiving body relatively in the same condition than when you took it, okay? That should be that's really what we aim to do. If you take water from a source, you use it, you release it back into the environment, it should be as clean, if not better, than than when you took it in. And I would say in Kingston we do well. We do a good job. Actually, Utilities Kingston does a fantastic job. Yes, the water tastes like chlorine, but you have safe drinking water. Stormwater flow management. Nothing is perfect, okay? So they also have to deal with stormwater management, water usage bylaws. So how often you can water your lawn when it's really dry in the summer. Those all fall under municipal jurisdiction and any bylaws that stem from that. So I want to introduce you, before I start talking about the 4 different ways that we manage water use in Canada and water taking in Canada, I want to introduce you to the term a riparian zone, because this is one of the approaches that is used, and Ontario is one of them, is based on riparian rights. So really what this is that transition zone between watercourse or body of water and upland area. So our riparian forest or riparian zone, wetlands could fall into that, floodplains could fall into that. Basically you have an upland area that does not get flooded regularly, you have your water body that is consistent, and somewhere in between you have a riparian zone. Okay? And if you think of way back when Canada started, The way that they divided territory was really, here's your plot of land and this is your access to water. Okay, so a lot of the Maritimes in Ontario, Upper Canada, tended to be divided that way and operated under that rule. Okay, so let's talk about water rights. First of all, does water have rights itself as an entity? And the answer is, yeah, sort of, it does. Okay, under Canadian law, because we're really nice, we're polite, we give water rights. Okay, so much of the overall rights associated with water are rooted in common law. Okay, basis of our legal system throughout Canada, except for Quebec, and they have their own way of managing water as well. And the other one that tends to govern as well is any precedents that have been created by previous court rulings prior to a date of saying this is the way we're going to do things now. Okay, so surface water rights is basically deals with, when we're talking about surface water rights, we're talking about natural water courses. And what a natural water course is something that has a definable periphery. Okay, you can say that this is a creek. Okay, permanent or seasonal but consistent. So it doesn't need to always be flowing. Okay, but it's permanent or seasonal, or it's consistent in terms of its presence. And it does have some riparian implications. Surface drainage is another term that we use. And in this case, it's water flow due to precipitation, and it can be in transient channels. Okay, like a ditch, for example, is a transient channel. A natural water course is defined as a stream of water which flows along a defined channel with a bed and a bank, and for a sufficient amount of time to give it a substantial existence. Okay. Engineers don't like those types of definitions. They're a little broad, a little vague, a little open-ended, but I'm sure you can appreciate this. It does give it some broadness. It does not have to be perennial, support water-related flora or fauna, so there's nothing tied to that, or always have a defined bed throughout its length. So here's where water has rights, okay? Water flows naturally and should be permitted to flow. Okay, so this is the rule that governs. So water flow must not be altered or diverted, and water flow in a natural water course has the right to flow. Okay, there's legislation around that, but if it's a water body, it has rights in terms of its ability to flow. So if we divert some, we can't divert all of it. Ditches or channels created to move water are generally not considered natural water courses, and these do not have rights. Okay, so if you have a ditch to channel water or an irrigation system to channel water, it does not have rights. Okay, it doesn't have the right to flow. We can have a permit to be allowed to do this, but it doesn't have a natural right to flow. Okay. In the end, if there is a dispute as to whether it is or not a natural water course, then the courts tend to decide that, and water goes to court. Okay, so here's some examples, and I want you to think about this. It's not that obvious. So is this a natural water or is this not? Let's vote. Natural water system? Oh, there's one very brave soul. Oh, there's another one. Okay, I'm going to ask again. Natural water course or no? Natural. Lift your hand up. Okay, not natural? Oh, you engineers, that looks natural. Come on, it's a natural water course. How about this one? Are you sure it's not natural? Just because we created a road over something and we decided to have a nice culvert to allow it to flow, because water has the right to flow, does that mean it's not natural? Okay, so that one's natural as well. How about this one? Natural, not natural. Okay, yes, okay, you got that one. Good. How about this one? There's actually no water, but does that mean that by definition it's not a watercourse? No. So natural? Yes? All right, thank you. This one? It's very symmetric. Natural watercourse or not? Come on, engineers. Natural or not? No? No. Okay, it's not. It's a ditch. This one? So the flow does not always need to be continuous. Okay, so is this one a natural one? Yeah? Okay. Finally, yes? You think this is right on the side of the road? Do you think that's a natural watercourse? No? I would agree that looks like a ditch. But you can see how jurisdiction, because some of those waterways may have formed because of human activity. So does it become a natural watercourse? So when do you define when it became a natural watercourse and it has a right to flow? So you can see how law can get very tricky at some point when people want to dispute whether they can divert water or not. Okay? Okay, so no surface water flow. So here what we're talking about is water that flows on the surface, so it does flow, but not in a defined, necessarily defined channel. So not in a river or creek per se. Okay, so we call it surface water flow. Okay, so when it rains a lot and you get these sheets of water that flows over the surface, that would be considered surface water flows. So no naturally defined channel of flow, often moves at a diffuse flow across an area, and water is usually moving somewhere. It's going to be moving downhill, and if you took a geography course on watershed, water moves downhill, so you can get an A. Water flows downhill until it reaches a low point, and then it flows together with other water and flows downhill eventually to the ocean. Okay, that's usually where we try to go. Okay, maybe not an A in geography, but at least a pass. Yes, okay. So it's once it reaches, so it includes collected water. So if we on purpose as a municipality collect stormwater, okay, that's still considered surface water. Okay, this is surface water. Okay, so you've got some standing water here. It's probably on Jeff's farm. And so, as I mentioned, it also includes collected surface water, so anything from your eaves troughs and water from surface of buildings and roofs, all that is considered surface water, and it does not have rights. Okay, not its own rights, but it can be regulated. Okay. And other things that we would have in terms of infrastructure, any water ponds that tend to hold water for discharge, I'm sure you've heard of some of these, and any drainage ditches that tend to accumulate water. Agricultural tilling falls under that, collected surface water. Okay, and in agricultural community, this is something they rely on quite extensively. So the fact that it's regulated is important, and the fact that there's legislation around that for water rights is important. Any artificial ditch, any street curb falls under collected surface water. Okay. And so when we put it in a nutshell, the distinction between natural water and a surface water is that surface flow has no rights to flow. Okay, it doesn't mean it doesn't flow. It means that it has no rights. We can divert it. We can get a license to collect it and treat it and do something with it. Okay, it doesn't have its own natural right to flow unimpeded. Surface water flow from a neighbor does not have the right to drain across to an adjacent neighbor. You can see how some fights might arise from that one too, right? You didn't slope your territory properly. Once surface water flows reach a natural water course, it has a right to flow. So as soon as it reaches that natural body of water, it's now part of that natural body of water, and then it has the right to flow. And the other point is that some prescriptive rights may allow water to flow in some cases. Okay, so we're going to deal with some important issues, well, things that I think are important. So the water rights concerning the removal and use of water in Canada. So typically when we're talking about water taking, and it is a term that's being used, we're talking about two sources, groundwater or surface water. Okay, so this is water that would naturally be in the environment and we want access to it. Okay, so up here we have surface water, obviously not the way we collect water in Canada, but it is the way they collect water in some places around the world. And this would be a treatment plant that is, water treatment plant that is collecting water from surface water. So different accesses to water rights. So water taking, because it's so important that we have access to clean and safe water, it requires a mechanism to allocate or distribute the right, or that right to extract water. And what it should do, if we were thinking about it fairly, it should balance the need of diverse end users. Okay, so personal use, industrial use, agricultural use, forest management, yada, yada, yada. It should be balanced. So theoretically, when we implement these, they should provide public confidence that it's equitable and sustainable in terms of management of the water resource, in terms of quality and quantity. So both are important, quality and quantity. Because if you have lots of water and it's polluted, that's a problem. And if you have pristine water and very little of it, that's a problem. Okay, so quality and quantity is difficult in some places. And in Canada, we've been blessed. We have lots of water and lots of clean water, okay? And if you look around the world, that's not always the case. We need to provide a commercial confidence, okay? If we want a thriving, resilient economy, we also have to take care of that commercial confidence that we can provide a continued use of that and access to that water. So those things need to be balanced. Okay, in terms of types of water rights, so I said there's different ways that we do things in Canada. So we'll start with the one that we use in Ontario, which is riparian rights. And what those do is they allow the owner of the water's edge to exploit the water. Okay? Must not impair other riparian owners. Okay, so your next door neighbor, so you can't take all the water. All right. Shortages must be shared amongst the users, and it may require permits for specific levels of water taking. And this is what, as I mentioned, we use in Ontario. We have a reasonable use provision. So water use must not interfere with the use of others unreasonably. Okay, water can be taken and exploited for a variety of purposes. So it's fairly broad, and it's fairly fair in its allocation or its assigning of rights. However, water can usually not be taken away from the riparian property. So what that means is I cannot say I have my water access, I'm going to take water, I'm going to bottle it, and I'm going to sell it. Okay? Not under those rules, or shouldn't. There is this, another system is called prior allocation or prior appropriation. And this is a first come, first serve basis. So I would say the ones that are in first come, first serve basis or prior allocation are the Western provinces. Okay, and if you think about discovering the Wild Wild West, I was here first. These are my rights to water. I'm generalizing quite a bit, or dramatizing, but British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Nova Scotia operate under this rule. So first come, first serve. The first owner to use the water resource has the opportunity to use the water resource preferentially. Occasionally, the prior user must prove that they're using water in an efficient manner, okay, in court. But really, this is typically that first bullet is what the spirit of the law is, or the rule is. In our first in time, first in right, a senior appropriator is known as the first to use the water resource, okay? The right to use the water is known, the right to use of that senior appropriator, their right to use the water is known as the priority. The junior appropriator are those who have less priority for the water resource. And the thing is, under this rule, or under this jurisdiction, water can be diverted. Okay, so different than the riparian law, or rules. In prior appropriation, it's not necessarily connected to land ownership. So in the first one, in the riparian, we're really tying land ownership and access to water. Here, it's not tied to access. So it allows for the diversion of water to properties that are not next to the watercourse. So this is actually important in Western Canada, if you think about it. So it's not that it's a silly rule, it's that in Western Canada, this is what was necessary. We have groundwater here, we have people living over here, we need to be able to move that water, or surface water. In times of shortage, first in right gets the priority. Okay, so that means they can use up to their usage, and the ones who are second may not get any water. Okay, is that outdated? Is that a model that needs to be revisited? Good question. Next question for you. Western US operates this way quite a bit. In terms of prior appropriation, a few other facts. Each may have a certain quantity allowed that they can use. And one of the silly things about that particular rule is if they have a specific amount that they're allowed to use and they don't use it, they may lose it. And so what tends to happen is they will extract it or use or take away as much as their certificate says or their license says because they're worried about losing that water, okay, which is not really great from a sustainability perspective. It must be used for a beneficial outcome, can only use what is needed, and the original intent of appropriation cannot be changed if it will impact others. So in terms of legality, if you want to change what you're using your water for, if it's going to impact others, then there will be some legislation around that. And in this case, the opportunity for sale of water rights does exist. Okay, so it didn't in the riparian system. In terms of the water rights, they're allocated by government to users that are for specific volumes and specific purposes. And as I mentioned, we have Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba that operate under this, as well as Nova Scotia, and it's not entirely, some extent, Nova Scotia. Okay, let's talk about groundwater rights. Groundwater rights are completely different than surface water. Okay, here we have absolute ownership. The landowner has the right to draw as much groundwater as they wish, okay, even though the aquifer may extend beyond their property line. The water can be used for anything, and there's no consideration for neighboring landowners. In Ontario, it's a bit different, okay, but in some jurisdictions, this is the rule. And it's prior appropriation or allocation. This is how groundwater flows. It is different where we are in Ontario, for example. Correlative theory, all landowners have equal rights to an aquifer for beneficial use, so that's kind of contrary to what we just said on the previous slide, right? You can use as much as you want as long as it's as long as it's good for your neighbors as well. Landowners cannot adversely affect their neighbors' use of an aquifer. You can take as much as you want out as long as you're not limiting your neighbor's use of the aquifer as well. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's why I said there's several layers and they need to be integrated a little bit better. The flow of water rights, allowance to draw water for specific flow rate. For example, in Ontario, it's 50,000 liters per day. Now, that may not mean a lot to you. If you want an example or something that you can wrap your head around, pretend you go home, you turn on the hose full blast, okay, and you let it run 24 hours a day. That's about 50,000 liters per day, okay? Not sure your neighbors would be pleased with you, but that's 50,000 liters per day that you can extract in Ontario without needing a permit. Allowance to store water, for example, we have up to 1 million liters for irrigation at a later date. So if they're predicting a drought, we need to have water. Okay, Canadian context. Riparian rights systems established from Ontario to the east except for Quebec and in the north. In Quebec, we are governed by Civil Code of Quebec. Water resources are common, which means that water resources are common to all. Water use permits are issued by different agencies, and we need to, the priority needs to be for the greater good, okay? And it's similar to allocation. In the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, it's managed by public water use boards, and all uses beyond domestic require permits, okay? And similar to allocation, but licenses can be terminated. So basically, prior allocation, for example, but you can terminate a license, whereas out west, you cannot terminate a license, okay? As settlement moved west, as I mentioned, we had the need for the prior allocation rules, and the riparian system just could not provide that same equal accessibility to water, which is why it was not put in place. In 1894, the Northwest Irrigation Act came into place, and in BC it was 1897. By 1900, most regions of west of Ontario had similar laws. Okay, 1930, water resources became the responsibility of the provinces. So it's not quite been 100 years, but it's getting up there. Might be time to revamp how we do things or look at it. Western provinces adopted the Federal Act with minor variations. Government ownership. The government owns all water resources. So after all that's said and done, any water resources in Canada are owned by the government, okay? Users are prohibited from using or diverting water without permission. So that's our overarching way that we govern water in Canada, is to say, basically, if you're going to use that water excessively, other than personal use, or want to divert it, you need a permit, okay? And that's where the licensing comes into play, and as I mentioned, domestic and agricultural use is considered minor. In terms of allocation by license, we need permits to divert water, and there's a good reason for that. You don't want water to be diverted without knowing where it's going, because you could create all kinds of problems in terms of flooding, okay, leaving water quality aside. There's minor use exemptions, early licenses granted to users for large volumes of water, often without expiry, and those licenses are still in place in some cases. And in those cases, the users could take a full amount of water out that's in the license, even if they can't use it. And a lot of times, the reason they do this is because they're afraid that there's a clause in their license that says, if you don't use it, we'll revisit how much water you use or you need in your permit. Okay, so senior allocation licensees may take the full amount of water without consideration for those junior licensees, and so they may not even get water. So it's not really great if we're concerned about water scarcity in the future when we're thinking about climate change and water distribution within Canada changing. Often non-transferable, so one of the things that is possibly an issue, some of those licenses to draw water may not be transferred or sold as standalone entities. They may go with the property, okay? So if you transfer your property over to somebody, they should have access to similar water use as you had in the past. High priority users, as municipal regions expanded, water conflicts became a reality, and they still are, even within Canada. Water rights can be transferred to high priority users at the expense of lower priority users. And so that balance still needs to be struck, and compensation's allowed. So let's look at a quick example, and then I'm going to stop. So if we have an agricultural irrigation project in Rideau Valley Waterway, and they want, so it's agriculture, they want the permission to draw 100 liters per day, or 100,000 liters per day, which is over their 50,000 liters per day allocation, and they want this to be a permanent water intake. So what would have to happen as we assess things? So if we look at Rideau Waterway, that's actually near Kingston, okay, so that would impact us directly. So the agencies that would have jurisdiction would be the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, and under the Water Resources Act, and also the Cataract Region Conservation Authorities. So that's another layer somewhere in between provincial and municipal government. We have the Water Resources Act, the Source Water Protection Act, and what they have to do is through that is do a source water protection plan and assess water stress that could happen as a result of that draw. So what they have to do is a stress analysis, okay? So no engineering talk is good without lots of diagrams that show lots of colors of things that could happen, okay? So we're looking at surface water quality here, and it's based on the selected parameters. So basically, if they were to take water from the surface, okay, so we're right here in this region near the Kingston area, and this is the Conservation Authority's regulatory area. And so to give you a snapshot, anything that's in kind of gray is insufficient data. Anything that's green is good. This doesn't count because it's not part of our CRCA, or that Conservation Authority's region. But we can see that along the water where we have lots of population, if we were to draw this as surface water, the stress would be significant, okay? There would be some stress. It would not be great water quality. So here we're talking about quality, not quantity. If we were to draw it from the ground, okay, it's a little bit better, okay? We're noticing that we have some impact in terms of quality, but not as much. Where we would have some impact, or considerable impact, has shifted, and it would be in the islands. Probably because they tend to be on, in some cases, on wells. And then finally, if we look at Tier 1 surface water stress, and what that means is it's the quantity of water. What you notice is if they were allowed to take 100,000 liters per day continuously, the impact would be moderate for any of the communities along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. And then finally, if the 100,000 liters was taken in terms of quantity from groundwater, we would have very low impact, except in the area that's close to the county, the edge of the county, and some of the islands. So ultimately, from this analysis, they would probably grant, because a combination of groundwater and surface water would have some impact. You can't take something away without having any impact, but it would not be something that would be disastrous for the community. Okay? And on that note, I would hopefully give you a few things to think about from a policy perspective, and I'd be happy to answer questions, although I'm not sure how that works.
So we have, forgive me, my mic is not working very well. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll now visit Slido for our questions. The first one, the Harper government gutted the Fisheries Act, and to a certain degree, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Has this improved under the Liberals?
Very good questions. I would say that, have we seen any improvement? I think there is more discussion on that level, but I would not say that we've seen anything from a legislative perspective. In terms of, from the Canadian environmental, looking at things from the Canadian environmental, one of the most important guidelines that's come out was really 2012 with the effluent, the managing, or not managing, but letting municipalities, telling them that they had to fall within a discharge guideline for water quality or wastewater quality. Other than that, I haven't seen too much that has changed on that level.
And the next question. Do you think that a national water policy framework would be beneficial to integration, or would it exacerbate interprovincial friction?
Don't go there. Okay. I don't think that you can, when you have different provinces that really have different access to water, I don't think that you will have less interprovincial friction. But I think that there needs to be further discussion. How that integration happens and on what level is really up to the policymakers. But I do think that it still needs to be a discussion that needs to happen. There needs to be further integration.
If Ontario has riparian rights, how can Nestle extract millions of liters of clean drinking water for profit?
Because it also has the right to have a business. And don't forget, I also mentioned that in some cases there were rules before the rules were set, and those rules stayed, right? And so depending on the details of their permits and when things were established in that property, then that would have been in place. I'm assuming that a lot of those are, so for example, if a new company wanted to come in and do a bottled water and sell that bottled water, that would be a problem. In terms of some of the other businesses, there's within that legal framework, there are some rules that apply to businesses that don't necessarily apply to a homeowner. Okay, so I don't have the specific answer for you about Nestle because I don't know what their permitting is.
Are there any questions from the crowd? No? Okay, we can move on Slido. What country has the most robust system of water governance, I think was that question.
The exact country I wouldn't know, but I would say Australia and Europe are pretty rigorous about their water usage and allocation.
Good. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Can you say more about what happened in Walkerton and the lessons learned?
Okay. Who asked that? Can I ask? How old are you? Oh, okay. I was going to say, it's a young person that's never heard of Walkerton. So I think what happened in Walkerton, my own personal opinion, so this is when I was coming out of school. Wow, it's a long time ago. Out of my PhD. And really what happened was, it was not just a E. coli, first of all, got into the water. It was really a management issue as well. So typically when you take water and before it goes into distribution, what you would do is you treat the water and there is a disinfection stage. So that chlorine that you do not like the taste of in your water is actually something that protects you, okay? And the reason that you want a residual chlorine level in your water, okay, is so that as the water gets distributed, because by the time it's treated and it reaches your tap, it could be a couple of days, okay? And you don't want bacteria that builds in a system and could potentially grow and then reinfect that water. So we want to keep a certain chlorine residual to make sure that the water is safe when you open your tap, all right? So in Ontario, we do that well. I have to say that we do that well. Walkerton aside, we do that well. However, at Walkerton, what had happened is they were falsifying some of their data in terms of the, on a Friday, if you're a technical operator and the buddies are waiting for you in the car, I'm just giving an example that's not necessarily the case, but there's been talk around that. Do you really want to go out and take a sample at that one station that's a little bit far so that you'll be late? So there weren't really rules around those. So there was falsifying of data. Standards weren't there in terms of how often you need to be sampling and reporting. Okay, so what's happened after that? So basically, some of the results came through that samples hadn't been taken, or data was falsified to say samples had been taken, and basically there wasn't enough disinfection in the system. Had there been enough chlorine in the system, Walkerton would not have happened. Those people would not have died. All right, so that's the lesson learned from there. So now, if you look at one of my earlier slides, we talk about in Ontario we have two things. One that looks at how water flows and is distributed, and one that really looks at training people and making sure that we know what our standards are, and we make sure that the people who are implementing or ensuring those standards have been trained properly, because that's as important. If I have somebody a student that's supposed to go take a sample and they don't understand why it's important to have that sample, part of that responsibility is mine. It's my responsibility to ensure that the people that I train understand the importance of their project. Okay, and that wasn't necessarily happening. The rules or regulations are in place. Why? Okay, so that needs to, and that comes through training and consistent training and regular training. And so that's what's happened with Walker. Did I answer your question, or is that a little bit of a tangent? Okay, thank you.
Great, so I think that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for joining us today and for taking the time to be here. We have a little gift for you. Excellent, thank you.